14 months after my husband died, I found a bank statement with his name on it showing more than $35 million. For 24 years, he made me believe we could barely afford a washing machine, while my mother borrowed money for surgery because he insisted we didn't have it. Then his sister offered me $850,000 on one condition: stop asking questions. I'm Elara Whitaker, and that was the moment I realized my husband's greatest secret wasn't the money. It was how many people had helped him hide it from me. Chapter 1. The Statement Behind the Wall. 14 months after my husband died, I found a bank statement with his name on it and a balance of $32,874,615.42. I read the number once, then again, then pressed my thumb against the paper as if the ink might smear and reveal something ordinary underneath. A printing error, a misplaced decimal, someone else's account. But the name was clear: Gideon Whitaker, my husband of 24 years. The man who once argued with me for 3 days over a washing machine. It was 2021, and the machine was 14 years old. It had begun shaking so hard during the spin cycle that a framed photograph fell from the laundry room shelf. The repairman quoted us $640. A new machine with the features we needed cost around $1,100. I thought replacing it made sense. Gideon folded the estimate, placed it beside his coffee, and said we could not wreck our retirement plan because I wanted something new. That was how he framed it. Not as a practical disagreement, but as proof that I was careless and he was responsible. We repaired the old machine. For years, I remembered that argument as one more example of Gideon being cautious with money. Now I was sitting on the floor of his home office, holding proof that he had nearly $33 million, while making me feel guilty over $460. My name is Elara Whitaker. I was 54 when I found the statement. I lived in Worthington, just north of Columbus, Ohio, in the same aging 3-bedroom house Gideon and I had shared since the early years of our marriage. I taught English composition at Franklin Ridge Community College. 3 classes each semester, stacks of student essays on the dining table, office hours that often stretched longer than scheduled because returning students needed more than grammar advice. Gideon and I married in September of 2000. I was 29, he was 39. He worked as a logistics operations manager and carried himself like a man who understood systems other people could not see. He was calm, methodical, dependable. He never misplaced his keys. He remembered appointments. He knew when the car needed an oil change before the dashboard light appeared. He told me his take-home pay was around $3,200 a month when we first married. By the years before his retirement, he said it had risen to about $5,800. The rest, he explained, disappeared into taxes, insurance, his 401k old obligations, and work-related expenses I never fully understood. We were not poor. We had a house, 2 used cars, health insurance, and enough food. But we lived with permanent financial caution, as though one medical bill or broken appliance could push us over an invisible edge. We clipped coupons. We postponed replacing the roof. We drove to state parks instead of flying anywhere. We discussed every purchase above $200. I learned to feel irresponsible whenever I wanted something that was not strictly necessary. Gideon was not cruel in ways people recognize easily. He brought me coffee every Saturday morning without being asked. He remembered my mother Ruth's birthday even when I forgot to mail her card. He planted an oak tree in our backyard in 2001 and spent years protecting it from deer and winter damage. When I graded papers late at night, he would come downstairs, drape a blanket over my shoulders, and tell me not to stay up too long. He never shouted. He never struck me. He never called me stupid. He simply handled the money. All of it. Bank mail went to his office. Passwords were stored in a notebook he kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. He spoke with the accountant. He prepared the tax documents and showed me where to sign. If a call involved investments, retirement, or anything connected to work, Gideon stepped into another room. I believed he was better at those things. After I found the statement, that belief began to look less like trust and more like training. The memory that hurt most came from March of 2018. My mother needed a hip replacement. Medicare and her supplemental insurance covered most of it, but not everything. There were deductibles, co-insurance, rehabilitation costs, and travel expenses because the specialist was outside her county. The remaining amount was $11,600. My younger sister Mara and I divided the bills between us. Gideon agreed that we could use $3,000 from our joint savings, but no more. He said we could not destroy our own retirement every time someone else had a problem. Someone else was my mother. I taught an extra summer course. Mara borrowed against her car. One afternoon, I sat in the hospital parking lot and cried because I felt I had failed Ruth at the exact moment she needed me. Gideon held me that night. He rubbed my back and said we had done everything we could. Standing in his office 7 years later, holding that bank statement, I wondered how he had managed to say those words without flinching. Gideon died in May of 2024 at 63. A heart attack, sudden and final. There had been no hospital vigil, no last conversation, no confession made under the pressure of running out of time. The estate appeared ordinary. The house still carried a small mortgage. A life insurance policy paid $92,000. His retirement account held $41,700. There was an older sedan, some watches, tools, family photographs, and the oak tree outside that had grown taller than the roofline. The money covered the funeral, a few debts, and part of the repairs the house needed. Nothing suggested hidden wealth. His sister Lenora arrived before I had fully understood that Gideon was gone. Elara Whitaker Hale was 60, polished even in grief, with a way of moving through rooms as though she already knew where everything belonged. She asked whether I had called Gideon's accountant. She opened drawers in his office without asking. She knew which cabinet held insurance papers and which shelf contained documents from his employer. At one point, she carried a file box toward the front door. I asked what was in it. She said they were Whitaker family records and that she would keep them safe until I was ready. I let her take the box. At the time, I thought grief made people territorial about memory. I did not yet understand that Lenora might have been protecting something more valuable than photographs. In July of 2025, I decided to refinance the remaining mortgage so I could finally replace the roof. I went into Gideon's office looking for the deed. The room still looked mostly as he had left it. A legal pad on the desk, 2 sharpened pencils in a ceramic cup, a faint ring where his coffee mug had rested every morning. I reached behind a box on the top shelf and found a flat manila envelope pressed against the wall. Inside was the statement from Halcyon Private Bank in Chicago. The date was December 2023. The balance was $32,874,615.42. A business card had been clipped to the page. Evan Mercer, Senior Relationship Manager. I checked the spelling of Gideon's name, the address, the account numbers, the bank logo. I searched for Halcyon on my phone and confirmed that the number on the card matched the bank's official office in Chicago. I did not think the money belonged to me. I thought about the washing machine. I thought about my mother. I thought about every time Gideon had said we could not afford something and made me feel ashamed for asking. Then I called the number. Evan Mercer answered after 2 rings. I told him my name. I told him Gideon had been my husband and that he had died 14 months earlier. I said I had found a statement and needed to understand what it was. Evan confirmed only that Gideon had been a client. He said he could not discuss the current balance, the account structure, or any associated parties by phone. I asked whether the statement was real. He paused. Then he said it appeared consistent with the bank's records. I told him I was Gideon's legal wife. There was another silence, longer this time. Then Evan said 3 words. He left instructions. I asked who the instructions were for. Evan would not answer. He told me I would need Gideon's death certificate, our marriage certificate, government identification, and the contact information for my attorney. The bank's legal department would have to review my request before any meeting could be scheduled. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table until the afternoon light faded from the windows. I did not call Lenora. I did not tell my neighbor Janice. I did not mention it to Owen at Franklin Ridge. I wrote 4 names on a legal pad: Lenora, Marcus Hale, Rafael Soto, Evan Mercer. The next morning, I found Nia Osei Bennett, an attorney in Columbus who specialized in trust litigation and estate disputes. Nia studied the statement without excitement. She told me she could not promise that any of the money belonged to me. Then she looked directly at me and said I should not let anyone convince me that I had no right to ask where it came from. That afternoon, she sent preservation notices to the bank Gideon's accountant and every institution connected to the account information we had. Less than 2 hours later, Lenora called me twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. Her voice was calm when I played the message. Elara, I just heard that someone is requesting some of Gideon's old records. I think we should talk before outsiders turn a family matter into a legal matter. I listened to it again. I had not told Lenora. Nia had not contacted her directly, yet she already knew. I looked down at the bank statement on my kitchen table and understood that I had not simply found an account. I had touched a system built to make sure I would never see it. Chapter 2. The Only Wife Who Didn't Know. The next morning, I drove to Pittsburgh to see my sister. Mara Voss Calder was 54 years younger than me and worked as a guidance counselor at a public high school on the east side of the city. She lived in a narrow brick house with a small kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee and garlic, no matter what time of day I arrived. I had not told her about the statement over the phone. I only said I had found something connected to Gideon and needed to show her in person. She read the copy at her kitchen table. Her eyes moved from Gideon's name to the balance, then back again. She did not ask whether the money was mine. She did not ask what I planned to buy, or whether any of it might reach her. She set the paper down and looked at me. So when Mom needed surgery, he already had this money. It was not really a question. I nodded. Mara stood and went to the hall closet. She returned with a plastic storage box that had belonged to our mother. After Ruth died in 2022, Mara had kept most of the medical records because she was the one who understood insurance forms better than I did. She placed the box between us and began sorting through folders. There were hospital statements, rehabilitation invoices, mileage records, and photocopies of checks. She found the calendar where I had written the dates of the summer course I took to cover my portion of the bills. Then she found a folded letter in Ruth's handwriting. Our mother had written it to Gideon after she returned home from rehabilitation. She thanked him for supporting Mara and me through a difficult time. She said she knew retirement planning mattered and that she appreciated everything he had done within our means. I read the final sentence twice. Within our means. Gideon had accepted that gratitude. He had allowed Ruth to believe the $3,000 he released from our joint account represented the limit of what we could afford. At the time, the private account in Chicago already held more money than my mother, Mara, and I would earn in several lifetimes. Mara watched my face. He let her thank him, she said. Yes, that seemed to hurt more than the number itself. On Monday, I met Nia in her office with the medical records and Ruth's letter. She read the letter carefully but did not immediately call it evidence. She was disciplined that way. She never confused something emotionally devastating with something legally useful. Nia explained that we still had 3 major questions. I might not be a beneficiary of whatever structure Gideon had created. I could still have a claim if marital assets had been moved or concealed to defeat my rights as his spouse. And most important, the source of the money mattered more than the balance on the statement. Gideon and I had lived in Ohio, and his probate estate had been opened there. Halcyon Private Bank operated the account from Chicago. If the money sat inside an Illinois trust, we would need counsel licensed there. Nia contacted Caleb Rowe, a 45-year-old trust attorney in Chicago. He would handle local filings and court procedure, while Nia remained lead counsel. The arrangement sounded expensive before anyone discussed an hourly rate. I left her office and drove directly to Franklin Ridge Community College for a faculty meeting. Diane Keller, the head of the humanities department, waited until everyone had taken a seat before telling us the budget had been cut again. 2 adjunct sections would disappear the following semester, possibly more. My teaching load could drop from 3 classes to 1. There was a full-time opening at another campus, but it was nearly 70 miles from Worthington. Applying would mean commuting more than 2 hours a day or moving away from the house Gideon and I had shared. I sat in that meeting with a copy of a $32 million bank statement inside my bag and calculated whether I could afford private health insurance if Franklin Ridge reduced my hours. That was the strange cruelty of the situation. A fortune existed. I simply had no legal right to touch a dollar of it. When I told Owen Pierce I needed to miss one class for a meeting in Chicago, he offered to cover without asking for details. Owen taught history and believed almost every personal problem could be improved by bringing someone soup or taking one obligation off their schedule. I accepted the help. It felt unfamiliar to be assisted without being made to feel irresponsible. Nia and I traveled to Chicago in September. Caleb joined the bank meeting by video because he was scheduled in court that morning. Halcyon Private Bank occupied several quiet floors of a glass building near the river. Nothing in the lobby displayed wealth openly. The furniture was simple, the lighting soft, the silence deliberate. Evan Mercer met us in a conference room. He explained that the bank's legal department had approved limited disclosure based on my marriage certificate, Gideon's death certificate, Nia's formal request, and a document already stored in the bank's records. He placed a folder on the table. The name on the first page was Whitaker Legacy Trust. Gideon had created it in June of 2011. He was listed as the settlor. Halcyon served as corporate trustee. The beneficiary designation was short. Lenora Whitaker Hale would receive 65%. Marcus Hale would receive 35%. My name appeared nowhere. I had expected Gideon might have left money to his sister. They had always been close. Their mother had raised them to believe blood family came before almost everything. But Marcus was not a Whitaker by birth. He had married Lenora, just as I had married Gideon. Marcus had been given more than a third of the trust, while I had been erased from it completely. I thought about the house I had maintained, the work I had done, the vacations I had skipped, the medical bills I had helped pay, and every purchase Gideon had taught me to question. 24 years of marriage had not earned me a single line in the document. Nia asked about Marcus. Evan said the preliminary record showed that Marcus had introduced Gideon to Klein Ferris and Ward, the law firm that drafted the trust. Marcus had also assisted with certain business transactions and received consulting fees. He could not explain more without broader authorization. Then Evan opened a second folder. The document inside was dated April 17, 2018, 2 weeks after my mother's surgery. It was a formal amendment to the trust. It carried Gideon's signature, a notary seal, and the signatures of 2 witnesses. Halcyon had accepted and stored it as a valid amendment. The language did not make me a beneficiary. It did not change Lenora's 65% or Marcus's 35%. Instead, it created a condition. If I ever discovered the trust and submitted a valid request, the bank could not deny me access to the information necessary to understand the structure and source of the assets. The trust would also pay for independent legal counsel to advise me. Near the end, Gideon had added 2 sentences. He believed I would know what to do. The bank was not to deny me access if I asked the right question. Nia closed the folder gently. "This gives you a right to information," she said. "It does not give you the money." I understood. But the date on the document was all I could see. Gideon had watched me cry over my mother's medical bills. He had watched Mara borrow money. He had watched Ruth apologize for being a burden. 2 weeks later, he had traveled to Chicago and created a path for me to discover the truth someday. Then he came home and said nothing. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was love. Maybe he was afraid. Or maybe he wanted to control the moment I learned the truth, even after he was gone. Lenora called that evening. She said Gideon had his reasons. She said the trust protected the Whitaker legacy and that involving lawyers would damage his memory. I asked how long she had known. "Long enough to know my brother never did anything without a reason," she said. I asked whether she had known about the trust when Ruth needed surgery. There was a pause. Then Lenora said my mother's medical expenses had nothing to do with Whitaker money. I asked whether she understood that Ruth had borrowed money while Gideon controlled millions. "That was not your mother's money," she said. The words were calm, almost impatient. They told me exactly how Lenora saw the world. The money belonged to the Whitakers. My work did not matter. My marriage did not matter. My mother's suffering certainly did not matter. Before Nia and I left the bank the next morning, Evan asked us to remain in the conference room for another minute. He had received permission to confirm one additional fact. Most of the trust's current value had been created after Gideon and I married. The $35 million had not been passed down through generations of Whitakers. Evan could not yet tell us where it had come from. I left Chicago carrying two truths that refused to fit together. Gideon had built a trust designed to exclude me. And Gideon had also left behind the document that allowed me to open it. Chapter 3. The Price of My Silence. The question was no longer whether Gideon had hidden money from me. The question was how many people had helped him do it. Lenora and Marcus arrived at my house 3 days after I returned from Chicago. They had flown in from Scottsdale and rented a black SUV from the airport. I watched it stop at the curb from my kitchen window. Lenora wore a cream-colored coat, even though the afternoon was warm. Marcus stood beside her in a navy sport coat, his hands resting loosely at his sides. They looked less like grieving relatives than two people who had agreed on the order in which they would speak. I opened the front door, but stayed inside the frame. Lenora glanced past me toward the hallway. "We only want to talk. We can talk here." Her expression tightened for half a second. "Elara, we all loved Gideon. None of us wants this to become ugly. It became ugly before I knew it existed." Marcus stepped forward. "This is exactly why we should keep emotions out of it." He spoke in the measured tone of a man accustomed to explaining contracts to people he expected to intimidate. "Trust litigation across multiple states is expensive. It can take years. Business records become public. Tax filings get examined. Gideon's professional reputation could be damaged in ways none of us can control." Lenora touched his arm as though reminding him to stay gentle. "What Marcus means is that Gideon made a private decision. He wanted the Whitaker assets preserved for the family." I looked at her. After 24 years, which family did I belong to? Lenora's mouth parted, but Marcus answered first. "No one is saying you were not important to Gideon. Apparently I was important enough to live with the restrictions, but not important enough to know what they were protecting." Marcus exhaled through his nose. "You could spend the next 5 years fighting this and end with less than the legal fees. Then you should speak with Nia Bennett." I held out Nia's business card. "Every conversation from now on goes through her." Lenora did not take the card immediately. When she finally did, she held it by one corner, as if it were something unpleasant. "We are trying to spare you pain." "No, you are trying to control when I stop asking questions." I closed the door before either of them answered. Through the front window, I watched them walk down the steps. Marcus leaned toward Lenora and lowered his voice, but not enough. "Call Ferris before she gets the tax files." I wrote the sentence down before their SUV reached the end of the street. When I repeated it to Nia, she went quiet. "They are not only concerned about the amendment," she said. "They are concerned about discovery." Why tax files? Because trusts can be explained, beneficiary choices can be defended, tax records show movement. If Gideon reported income somewhere that he never disclosed to you, that may tell us where the money came from. The pressure did not stay on my porch. 2 days later, I received a message from Melanie Brooks, one of Gideon's cousins. We had never been close, but we exchanged Christmas cards and saw each other at large family gatherings. "Elara Lenora told me you are trying to take money Gideon set aside for his family. I know you are grieving, but please do not destroy his memory over this." I read the message 3 times. Lenora had turned me into the intruder before I had even filed a claim. I kept my replies short. "I have not asked anyone to choose a side. I will not give up my right to learn how the assets were created." Melanie did not answer. The following week, Lenora called again. I almost let it go to voicemail, but Nia had told me I could answer as long as I did not negotiate or make promises. Lenora's voice was softer than it had been on my porch. I have arranged something generous. What does that mean? It means you do not have to drag this through court for years. You could repair the house. You could stop teaching if you wanted. You could live comfortably. And what would you get? An end to this. What is the amount? The attorneys will send the paperwork tomorrow. She paused. I am doing this because Gideon cared about you. If Gideon cared about me enough to leave me money, why did he leave all of it to you and Marcus? Lenora ended the call without answering. The offer arrived the next afternoon from Klein, Ferris & Ward, $850,000. Lenora had approved it as the primary beneficiary. In exchange, I would release every claim against the Trust Halcyon Private Bank, Whitaker Freight Analytics, Lenora, and Marcus. I would stop requesting documents. I would never discuss the trust, the business, or the negotiations. The confidentiality clause was broad enough to prevent me from telling anyone how Gideon had lived with me for 24 years while hiding the truth about our finances. $850,000 was more money than I had ever expected to possess. It was enough to repair the roof, pay off the mortgage, purchase health insurance, and invest the rest carefully. It was enough to stop worrying about whether Franklin Ridge would cut my classes. That same day, Diane Keller called me into her office. She closed the door before speaking. I can guarantee you one section next semester. I cannot promise more. I looked at the spreadsheet on her desk. One class would not keep me eligible for the same benefits. No. What about the full-time opening? You would be a strong candidate, but the commute is 70 miles each way. I drove home calculating gasoline, insurance, mortgage payments, and the amount I would need to retire without becoming dependent on Mara. The settlement letter sat on my kitchen table. For one night, I let myself imagine signing it. I could be done. No courtrooms, no tax files, no more calls from Lenora. The next morning, I met Nia. I placed the offer in front of her. If I take this, am I being practical, or am I letting them buy my silence? Nia did not give me the answer I wanted. You have the right to accept it. $850,000 is meaningful. Litigation carries risk. She turned to the release provision. But they are not only buying your claim, they are buying your right to see the records. They want you to stop asking before you know what you are giving up. I looked at the page again. The amount suddenly seemed less like generosity and more like a locked door with money taped to the outside. I am not claiming I deserve all of it. I know. I just want to know where it came from. Then do not sell that question yet. I rejected the offer. Nia filed a motion for expanded disclosure. That was when Simone Price entered the case. Simone was 47 and worked as a forensic accountant. She wore dark glasses with narrow frames and kept her notes in a yellow legal pad covered with small, precise handwriting. At our first meeting, she spread several preliminary statements across Nia's conference table. Money does not disappear, she said. It only passes through enough doors that ordinary people stop following it. She requested business records, bank statements, K-1 forms, tax schedules, consulting agreements, trust distributions, and every payment connected to Marcus Hale. The first major discovery was a company I had never heard of, Whitaker Freight Analytics, LLC. Gideon had formed it in April of 2008. It was not an empty shell. It had provided route analysis and warehouse optimization services to regional trucking companies. It held interests in industrial properties and shares in a route planning technology platform. Marcus had helped Gideon find the company's earliest clients. He had also connected Gideon to several commercial real estate deals. I had lived with the owner of a profitable consulting company and never known it existed. Rafael Soto, the accountant who prepared Gideon's taxes, was required to turn over records. He confirmed that Gideon controlled the entire filing process. Some years we filed separately because Gideon said it protected me from business liabilities. When we filed jointly, he gave me only the summary pages and pointed to the electronic signature line. Business schedules and K-1 forms were never sent directly to me. Several returns contained electronic signatures under my name. I remembered signing tax documents. I did not remember seeing the company's name. Nia was careful. This does not prove he forged your signature. I understand. It does show he controlled what you were allowed to review. That sentence stayed with me. What I was allowed to review. Not what existed, not what affected our marriage, only what Gideon decided I needed to see. During one of those meetings, Owen covered my office hours at Franklin Ridge. He did not ask why I needed the time. He simply said he would leave my students' messages in a folder on my desk. It struck me how different help felt when it came without judgment. 2 weeks later, Simona asked me to come to Nia's office. She had found a transfer dated April 2008. $78,000 had been withdrawn from our joint savings, and a home equity line then deposited into Whitaker Freight Analytics as business capitalization. I stared at the description. In 2008, Gideon had told me we were restructuring debt and using part of the house equity to lower our mortgage costs and prepare for roof repairs. The roof had never been replaced. I told Simone what Gideon had said. She nodded slowly. If this were only one transaction, it would not automatically make the entire trust marital property. She tapped the transfer record. But it proves the business did not begin with Gideon's separate money. I looked up at the ceiling of Nia's office and thought about the water stain spreading above my own bedroom at home. For 17 years, I had believed the house was the one thing Gideon and I were protecting together. Now I knew he had used its equity to finance a business I was never allowed to see. Even the security beneath my own roof had been taken somewhere else and invested without my knowledge. Chapter 4. The money trail he couldn't bury. Once Simone found the first transfer, the rest of the money began to leave a trail. It did not happen all at once. There was no single ledger marked hidden fortune, no document where Gideon admitted what he had done. There were deposits, consulting contracts, property records, tax schedules, and investment statements spread across 17 years. Simone arranged them in order. The $78,000 from our joint savings and home equity line had capitalized Whitaker Freight Analytics in 2008. The company then earned real revenue from logistics consulting and route analysis. Gideon reinvested much of the profit instead of bringing it into our household. He purchased interests in 3 warehouse properties, one in Ohio, one outside Joliet, Illinois, and one near Phoenix. He also acquired shares in a route optimization company that later expanded nationally. Beginning in 2011, money moved regularly from the business into the Whitaker Legacy Trust. The amount on the statement I found had not come from one lucky investment. It had come from years of profitable work, rising industrial property values, long-term investments and income generated during our marriage that Gideon had never disclosed to me. The numbers became precise as discovery continued. The account held $32,874,615.42 in December of 2023. It was worth $34,216,908 on the date Gideon died. By the time Simone completed the first full valuation, the trust held approximately $35.1 million. I looked at the final number on the spreadsheet and thought about every time Gideon had told me we needed to be realistic. Simone pointed to a separate column. This is Marcus. Marcus had not merely introduced Gideon to a few clients. He had received consulting fees for years. He helped manage the warehouse. Investments earned percentage fees when properties were sold. Introduced Gideon to Klein Ferris and Ward, and new profits were being transferred into the trust. Some of the management fees had not been clearly disclosed in the records originally produced by the trust. Marcus was not a passive beneficiary. He had helped build the structure that made him one. That explained the 35%. It did not make it easier to accept. Lenora called me in January and asked to come alone. I hesitated, then agreed to meet her at my house, while Nia remained available by phone. Lenora arrived carrying a box of shortbread cookies, the brand Gideon used to buy every Christmas. She placed them on the kitchen counter as if returning to the role of grieving sister might erase everything that had happened. For several minutes, she spoke only about Gideon. She told me how frightened he had been of disappointing their mother. Helen Whitaker had believed family assets should remain with blood relatives because spouses could leave and children could be influenced by outsiders. Lenora spoke of this as though it were a principle handed down through generations, rather than a fear their mother had taught them. Gideon believed he was protecting something larger than one marriage, she said. I looked at her across the table. Which family mattered, Lenora? The family he was born into, or the one he chose to build with me? Her hands tightened around her coffee cup. He never stopped caring about you. Caring about me was not the same as trusting me. You were protected. I was kept uninformed. She looked toward the window. If you had not forced this into court, the First Phoenix Warehouse investment could have continued supporting the people Gideon intended to protect. I did not answer immediately. The Phoenix Warehouse had appeared only in Simone's restricted discovery files. It had not been discussed publicly. I had never mentioned it to Lenora. I set down my cup. How long have you known about the Phoenix property? Lenora's eyes shifted back to mine. That is not the point. It is exactly the point. She stood. You are going to destroy the way people remember him. I am not destroying Gideon's reputation. His records are describing what he did. The warmth disappeared from her face. She left the cookies on the counter. I called Nia before Lenora's car was out of sight. Her accidental reference to Phoenix mattered, but the next discovery mattered more. Simone found 2 emails Gideon had sent to Victor Klein in April of 2018, shortly after my mother's surgery. The first asked one question. If Elara discovers the trust, what is the likely spousal exposure? The second was even clearer. Can disclosure be required without changing the beneficiaries? I read both emails in Nia's office. Gideon had known I might have a claim. He had not created the amendment simply because guilt overwhelmed him. He had asked how much legal risk I represented. He had wanted me to have access if I discovered the trust, but he had not wanted to change what Lenora and Marcus would receive. He had built a door into the wall. He had also made certain the wall remained standing. Nia closed the file. This helps us show that he anticipated a challenge. It also shows he knew what he was doing. Yes, she did not soften it for me. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for April in Cook County. Nia and Caleb prepared me carefully. The hearing would not decide that the entire trust belonged to me. It would determine whether my claim had enough factual and legal support to continue how much additional disclosure the trust would be required to provide, and whether some portion of the assets could be reviewed as part of the marital estate. Victor Klein represented the trust. He was composed, experienced, and far more careful than Marcus had been on my porch. His argument was not ridiculous. Gideon had legal authority to manage our joint accounts. Whitaker Freight Analytics had been operated through his labor and expertise. I had benefited from the income he contributed to our household. The trust was a valid estate planning instrument. The 2018 amendment did not change its beneficiaries. Victor also emphasized that no one had proven my electronic signatures were forged. Nia did not claim they were. She presented the pattern. Joint assets had been used to start the company. The company produced income during the marriage. Business schedules were withheld from me. Gideon reported a much smaller picture of his earnings at home. Profits moved into investments and then into a trust that excluded me. Simone displayed a simple chart. Joint account, Whitaker Freight Analytics. Investment assets, Whitaker Legacy Trust. Fees and distributions to Marcus and Lenora. Victor stood. One initial transfer of $78,000 does not convert every dollar Mr. Whitaker later earned into marital property. Simone looked directly at him. If this were one transfer, you might be right. She indicated the records. But this is a 17-year pattern of capitalization, retained income reinvestment, and concealment. Rafael Soto testified next. Under questioning, he confirmed that Gideon controlled the tax process. Nia asked whether he had ever sent the full business schedules directly to me. No. Did you ever confirm that Mrs. Whitaker had reviewed them? No. Did Mr. Whitaker ever give you a reason? Rafael paused. He said Elara did not need the business schedules. The words were simple. They still changed something inside me. For years, I had believed I was too anxious about money. I thought I lacked financial discipline. I believed I had failed my mother because I had not saved enough. I believed Gideon was the responsible one, and I was the person who needed limits. Sitting in that courtroom, I understood that I had not made bad choices. I had made choices using false information. That realization mattered more than the balance in the trust. Judge Helena Ward issued her preliminary ruling several weeks later. She did not award me $17 million. She did not declare that I owned half the trust. She found that I had presented enough evidence for the claim to continue. A significant portion of the assets could potentially be reviewed as part of an augmented marital estate. Disclosure had to continue. Payments and distributions involving Marcus and Lenora could be examined more closely. If the parties did not settle, the case could proceed toward trial. It was a procedural victory. It was also the first time the system Gideon built had been required to answer to me. That evening, Melanie sent a message. I did not know the company began with money from your joint account. Lenora did not tell me that. I replied once. None of us knew the whole story because Gideon made sure each person saw only one part. 3 days later, Victor Klein called Nia with an offer, $12.5 million. Simone's preliminary valuation placed the portion I might reasonably protect closer to $17 million. But Nia reminded me that trial meant more time, more expense, more exposure, and no guaranteed result. For the first time, no one else was deciding what I was allowed to know. But having a real choice meant I would have to live with whatever I chose next. Chapter 5. The Life No One Could Choose for Me Again. I did not reject the $12.5 million offer that day. I took the documents home, placed them on the kitchen table, and spent the evening looking at numbers that no longer felt abstract. I was 54. Franklin Ridge could guarantee me only one class the following semester. The roof still needed to be replaced. A trial could last years, and even a strong case could be weakened by delay appeal or one legal interpretation I could not control. When I met with Nia and Simone again, I told them I did not want to confuse principle with recklessness. Nia did not congratulate me for being cautious, and she did not push me toward trial. She walked me through the risks carefully. We could win more. We could also receive less. The legal fees would continue. More private records would become part of the case. Lenora and Marcus could appeal. I could spend years building my life around Gideon's decisions, even after his death. Simone placed her valuation beside Victor Klein's offer. The portion of the trust we could reasonably defend was close to $17 million. But reasonable did not mean guaranteed. That helped me define what I wanted. I did not want all $35.1 million. I did not want to destroy Lenora or Marcus. I did not want revenge so complete that it became another form of control. I wanted the part of the life Gideon had hidden from me to be recognized as something I had helped build. Nia rejected the $12.5 million offer. The trust returned with $15.8 million. The number was closer, but the settlement draft included a restriction that mattered more than the money. It would have prevented me from discussing the source of the assets the way Gideon controlled our financial information, the first offer of $850,000, and almost every part of my own marriage connected to the case. I was willing to protect customer records, private investment details, and confidential business information. I was not willing to sign away the right to describe my own life. For 24 years, Gideon had decided what I was allowed to know. I would not let his sister and her attorneys decide what I was allowed to say. The negotiations continued through June of 2026. The final agreement paid me $17.1 million as a gross civil settlement. An additional $210,000 reimbursed part of the legal fees I had already paid. A tax attorney and financial advisor helped me handle the obligations that followed. There was no criminal judgment. No one admitted to fraud or any other crime. Marcus agreed to return part of the management fees that had not been fully disclosed. Several earlier distributions were adjusted as part of the settlement. Lenora and Marcus retained what remained in the trust after my payment, legal expenses, and the other corrections. I had not won half the trust because I was automatically entitled to half. The settlement existed because of the joint capital used to create the company, the income generated during our marriage, the concealment of the business records, the discovery process, and the risk the preliminary ruling created for the trust. Marcus did not lose everything. He did have to bring another partner into his real estate company and use personal assets to cover part of his legal costs. His role in Whitaker Freight Analytics became part of the civil record. He could no longer present himself as a relative who had simply been named in Gideon's private estate plan. He had helped build the system. Now the system had named him. Lenora also remained financially secure, but she lost the part of the trust she had treated as guaranteed. She lost control over the story she had told Melanie and the rest of the family. Several relatives stopped defending her after the source of the business capital became clear. She never apologized. I did not expect her to. A week after the settlement was signed, she sent me a message saying Gideon would not have wanted the matter to end this way. I answered that Gideon had 24 years to choose a different ending. She did not contact me again. At Franklin Ridge, Diane asked me to come to her office near the end of summer. She had received funding for a new program called Second Chapter Writing. It was designed for adults returning to school after divorce, illness, grief, caregiving, or long interruptions in their education. Owen had suggested my name. Diane asked whether I wanted to lead it. For the first time in my career, I could answer without calculating whether the position included enough hours to preserve my health insurance. I accepted because I wanted the work. I still loved teaching people who thought their stories had ended before they reached the classroom. Mara and I also created the Ruth Voss Medical Bridge Fund. It helped older women cover deductibles, rehabilitation travel, and the income lost by family members who cared for them after surgery. Mara joined the advisory board. We did not create it to prove that we were better people than Gideon. We created it because our mother had once believed her health had become a burden to her daughters. I wanted other women to have a choice Ruth never had. The first personal purchase I made was a washing machine. I went to the store alone. I did not buy the most expensive model. I chose the one that fit the house, had the features I needed, and came with a reliable warranty. For several minutes, I stood in front of it waiting for guilt to arrive. It did not. I kept the old repair receipt in a folder at home, not because I wanted to remain angry, but because financial control does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a reasonable decision, repeated often enough, that one person stops trusting her own judgment. 2 weeks after the settlement, I returned to Halcyon Private Bank. Evan Mercer met me in the same quiet conference room where I had first seen the trust documents. I asked him about the day Gideon signed the 2018 amendment. Evan said Gideon had come alone. He had asked several times whether the bank would be required to give me access if I discovered the trust and asked the right question. He had not changed the beneficiaries. He had not explained why he wanted the amendment. I asked Evan whether Gideon had seemed sorry. Evan considered the question before answering. He said Gideon had looked like a man who knew he had allowed too much time to pass, but still wanted to leave behind a path. I thanked him. On the drive back to Ohio, I understood what that meant. Gideon had left me a path. He had also required me to find it alone. That was not redemption. It did not erase the years he had hidden the truth or the choices he had taken from me. But it was part of who he had been. In the fall, I placed a wooden bench beneath the oak tree Gideon planted in 2001. I did not cut the tree down. I did not remove every photograph of him from the house. I also stopped protecting the simple version of him. Gideon had loved me in ways that were real. He had brought me coffee, remembered my mother's birthday, and sat beside me through ordinary illnesses and difficult years. He had also controlled me through a financial lie that lasted almost 2 decades. Both things were true. Love did not erase the harm. The harm did not make every good memory false. One morning, I sat beneath the oak tree preparing lessons for the second chapter writing program. The roof had been replaced. My notes rested on my lap. From inside the house, I could hear the new washing machine running. Mara sent me a message confirming that the Ruth Voss Medical Bridge Fund had approved its first case. A 67-year-old woman would receive help with rehabilitation after surgery. I thought about the woman I had been in the hospital parking lot crying because $11,600 felt large enough to destroy our future. I could not give her back the years she had spent afraid. I could not recover the trips I had declined, the decisions I had postponed, or the honest conversation Gideon had never allowed us to have. Justice did not return time. It returned something he had kept from me for too long: the right to decide what happened next. Do you think Gideon's final instructions proved that he loved me, or only that he knew what he had done was wrong? And if someone offered you $850,000 to stop asking questions, would you take it or keep fighting for the truth? Subscribe for more stories about women who stopped letting other people decide what they deserved.